Hi, thank you for joining, and thank you to IPPS Southern Region for the invitation to develop this video for the members. I'm Chris Marble. I'm a weed scientist at the University of Florida, and my focus is on weed management and nursery production. One of the most difficult but important aspects of good weed control program in nursery production is going to be your herbicide rotation. So what I'm going to talk about and what I'm going to cover are 3 simple steps to developing rotation so that you can manage weeds more effectively. What is a good rotation? First, I'm going to need to describe what a good rotation is. And the way that I describe it is that it is a planned but very flexible schedule of herbicide treatments. And the reason that it's flexible is because you always are going to need to scout and evaluate what's working and what's not so that improvements can be made. The rotation of this schedule of treatments is going to be based upon the season and the weeds that are most prevalent. Number 2 is going to be the crop tolerance, which is always going to be the most important. The herbicides have to be safe for the crops or they're not going to do you any good. And then also we've got to stay within annual application limits. We're only going to get 2 or 3 applications with any herbicide. So we're going to need to figure out when that herbicide can perform its best to get the best control and for it to be the most cost effective. The last part is just to note that rotations need to be based upon your nursery, your conditions, your plants, your weeds. I'm going to show some examples of rotations in this presentation, but these examples are probably not going to work for your nursery, or they might not work for your nursery, and they might be actual horrible choices depending upon your plants and your weed spectrum. But the point is, though, that I'm going to go through and show you the steps and processes that you can make a rotation that's going to work for you in your specific situation. So here are the 3 simple, but not necessarily easy steps in developing your rotation. First, we're going to figure out what herbicides can be used. And this is going to be based upon the label, of course, but then you might also have to do some small scale testing to see if a particular herbicide is going to work for your situation. Secondly, we're going to talk about knowing what weeds we need to target and when we need to target them based upon the season. And then lastly, the 3rd step is talking about how to pick the best options for your situation, which is basically combining both of those, safety and efficacy. That's going to be based upon the strengths of these herbicides and where we can fit them into a program. And as we talk about some of the options and different ways to do this, you'll realize that while it's a simple process, depending upon your crops and your situation, it's not always necessarily easy to do. So the first step is probably going to be the most important, and that's just figuring out what herbicides that you can use. And by this, I'm talking specifically about crop safety. A lot of the most common ornamental plants that are already on the herbicide labels, but if you grow some niche type species or hard to find species or possibly tropical plants, a lot of your product line might not be listed on any herbicide label. And this is where testing out new herbicides on a small section of the production block can really come into handy to see what works and what is safe. Or you could also possibly consider pulling maybe 6 to 7 plants of each species that you're growing, doing some small scale research plots, doing some testing, looking for phyto or injury or stunning after 3 to 4, maybe 5 weeks after an application, and see if that herbicide is going to work in your situation. So here's a list of all the options that you have available to you in container production. And these are all color coded by mode of action or group number, which is the WSSA or Weed Science Society of America group number. These are mode of actions, herbicide mode of action. So for nursery crops, we mostly have groups 3, 14, 15, 21, and 29. We have a lot of different herbicides. You can see here on this chart, we have maybe 20 or so. But not necessarily a lot of different modes of action or different active ingredients. We have about 5 modes of action, and then then we have a lot of different combinations of these modes of action. So when we get down to the brass tacks, we don't really have a ton of options. So rotating through different modes of action can be very difficult, but we'll talk about some ways that it can be done so that you're still getting good weed control, preventing resistance development, and then getting good crop safety also. So here's just the same information that I had on the previous slide, but it's broken down by formulation. And so one decision that you're going to need to make is whether you want to use sprayable herbicides, granular herbicides, or maybe some sort of combination of sprayables and granulars. Benefits of sprays are going to be primarily that they're easier to apply, cost much less than granulars, whereas granulars might be safer on some species. And then you also have a lot more over-the-top options in terms of active ingredients and modes of action. Good programs are going to be able to be built with either sprayables or granulars or both. It really just depends upon your preference, your nursery layout, and your available equipment. A really good, great free resource that you can use to help you develop your rotation, and we also even have some examples of rotations, is the 2017 Southeast Pest Control Guide. And in the weed management chapter of this guide, we have safety and efficacy information for almost every pre-emergence herbicide that is currently registered for use in nurseries. And this is what we're going to use in this presentation to develop a rotation. I call this your textbook. And so you can go to the link that's provided and download a copy of that, or order a hardback or a hard copy of it for maybe around $20 or so. So back to our first step of knowing what our options are, let's use gardenia as an example. So we need to develop a rotation for gardenia. So we look in the pest control guide that we just talked about, and we see all the different herbicides that have Gardenia jasminoides listed as a crop on the label. So that's pretty convenient stuff right there. Pretty easy to figure out what all is labeled and what all that we know that we have good safety data on, and what all we can use for that particular crop. In this example, we're going to say that we just want to use granular options, so we're just going to have those. So on this slide, I'm listing everything, all the granular options that are labeled for use on Gardenia jasminoides. Now, you're not going to be just growing gardenia, but there's going to be a lot of overlap with a lot of the other crops. And so you just have to start somewhere. So in this example, we're going to start with gardenia. Now, we have a lot of options, 14 in fact, in terms of individual herbicides I listed on the previous slide. But a lot of those herbicides are pretty similar to each other in terms of their mode of action and maybe their spectrum, or the types of weeds and species that they control. So in this slide, what I'm doing is I'm grouping the herbicides by their mode of action, which is what we're doing here. So here we have the group 14 plus 3. We have in the group 14 plus 3, we have our oxyfluorphan combinations, herbicides like biathlon, route, OH2, and I also have Forte on this list. It's a little bit different because its group 14 herbicide is flumioxazin. So it does have a little bit different weed spectrum of control compared with the other 14 plus 3 combinations, which have oxyfluorphan as the group 14. We also have some different things like Pendulum and Regal K, which is our group 3s. Marengo is a group 29. We have a lot of 3 plus 21 combinations like Gemini, Snapshot, Fortress. Freehand is a group 15 plus 3. And then finally, we have some group 14s, which would be options like Broadstar and Ronstar. So a lot of different options there. So when we're picking herbicides to rotate, though, we wouldn't want to just pick more than 1 or 2 of the herbicides from each of these groups, because they're pretty similar and they wouldn't be good rotation partners. So depending upon cost, availability, efficacy for specific species, and safety, we might pick 1 or 2 different herbicides from each of these broad mode of action groups to use in our rotation. We don't want to repeat similar herbicides too many times. So for example, if we start our rotation with OH2, which is a group 14 plus 3, we wouldn't necessarily want to rotate that with biathlon, which is another group 14 plus 3. The only difference between those 2 herbicides is that the group 3 that's in those. So like in OH2, we have pendimethalin as the group 3, and then biathlon is prodiamine. And then pendimethalin and prodiamine often perform fairly similarly in nursery environments, so you wouldn't want to rotate those with each other. So step 2, the main thing that we want to consider after crop safety is efficacy, or how effective different herbicides are on different species. That's step 2, knowing what herbicides we need to target and how we need to target them. So you're going to know what weeds you need to target based upon previous experience and record keeping, hopefully. Weed maps might be a good idea to be able to keep track of different pressures and different weed species throughout the nursery, and also noticing when any species shifts start to occur. So for example, in the summer, you might primarily battle with spurge, and then as fall and winter approaches, the spurge starts dying out, we might to see more bittercress and poa or annual bluegrass. And so knowing when those different weed shifts start to occur is going to help us to develop our rotation and know when to switch from one herbicide or one mode of action to another. So when selecting herbicides for different times of the year, you want to ask yourself, what's the worst weed in the spring, summer, or fall? And for this worst or this number one weed, you're going to have to pick a herbicide that's going to be good on your first or your number one weed. Then at the same time, that first weed is bad, we want to know what those secondary weeds are. They're not as problematic as our number one weed or our worst weed, but they're still problematic. And so the herbicide option that we need to pick, it's going to need to be effective or the best option for that worst weed. But then we also want to pick an option that's good or for that also provides some control of those secondary species. So an example of this might be in the warm season, your worst weed might be spurge. And so you want to pick something herbicide wise that's really great on spurge. But at the same time, spurge might be an issue. You might also see eclipta, annual grasses, longstalk phyllanthus. So you want to pick options that are at least okay on the annual grasses and phyllanthus, but great or very good on that worst weed, the spurge. So in contrast, in the cool season, you might have something where it's bittercress as the worst weed, and then secondary species, you might have mulberry weed, oxalis, and chickweed. And so you want to pick a great option for bittercress, and then make sure that that great option is at least pretty good on those other secondary species. So let's go for an example here. A grower's top issue during the summer is spurge, and they also have issues with eclipta, annual grasses, and in this case, we're going to say that they only want to use granular options, which are by far the most common formulation that's used in container production. So what we would do is pull back out our 2017 Southeast Pest Control Guide, and we'd look up spurge. So all the herbicides that are ranked as good, fair, or poor for each weed species. So that's how these efficacy charts are in this particular guide. So for spurge, we want to pick a good option that's ranked as G. For eclipta and grasses, a good option would be great to have, but really spurge is our first priority because it's our worst weed. And so we have to find an option that's good for spurge, and then we could go with maybe a fair option for those annual grasses and eclipta. If we had to, based upon crop tolerance, availability, etc. So our options for spurge that are ranked as good in this particular guide are listed here. So we have a lot of 14+3 combinations. We also have indaziflam, some isoxaben combinations, group 15+3, and then also a group 14. And these would all be good options for spurge. So now that we know our options for spurge, let's take a look and see, let's see what works for eclipta. So eclipta is going to be a tougher weed to control. Thankfully, it's not near as common as spurge, but if eclipta is an issue, our options are going to become more limited than they would be if spurge was the only thing that we're battling. So in this, we look back up at the guide and we see what's ranked as good or at least fair on eclipta. So now let's combine those, the options that are great or good for spurge, and then also at least fair on eclipta. And in this case, we have group 14+3 combinations, route, forte. We also have group 29, Marengo. Group 15+3 is freehand, and then also group 14, broadstar. So these are the options that would be at least good for spurge, and then at least fair on eclipta. So now let's figure out how we could, using these herbicides, develop a rotation and put it in during the season when spurge and eclipta are problematic. So in this case, we could use Forte, Marengo, and Freehand in this particular example, or other herbicides. There were several other options that we could choose, and that's if all were safe for the crops in the summer or warm season. And so in this case, choosing these three particular herbicides, we're actually applying 4 different modes of action and not repeating the same active ingredient in this 3 application sequence. So that's pretty good for a 3 application rotation right there. So now that we went over the process of figuring out what's safe and what's going to be effective, the last option is combining the safety and data information and picking the best options you can for your crops and your weeds. It's a pretty simple process, but not necessarily easy depending upon the crops. So finding good and safe options can be tough, but you just got to do the best you can. And there's not a lot of great herbicide options that are safe, You can always focus more on sanitation, frequent hand weeding, and things like this are going to really provide about 80 to 90% probably of your weed control success anyways. Another thing that you could focus on will be using non-chemical controls like mulch if you didn't have a lot of good herbicide options for a particular crop, like maybe hydrangea. So to quickly review our to-do list and priorities, the first priority is efficacy-wise after safety is determined, because safety is going to be the first step and the first priority. But after we do that, it's going to be picking a herbicide that's effective on our most problematic species, and then it's also at least fair, good on those secondary species. We want to pick some different options here if possible with different modes of action. That's because no one herbicide or no one mode of action is going to control all the weeds. So if we use two different herbicides with different weed spectrums, even if one of those options is not great for those secondary species, our next application, our next herbicide might be, or we can choose it to be. Rotating like this won't give those secondary species enough time to take over and really cause a lot of issues. So for example, if spurge is our #1 priority and eclipse is a secondary priority, we could choose something like freehand as our first application. It's good on spurge, but it's just fair on eclipse, not the best option for eclipse, but it'll provide some control. That's okay in this scenario, because if we follow that up with Marengo and Broadstar, both of those options will be good on spurge and eclipse. And then similarly, in the cool season, we might have bittercress and oxalis as our primary species, and we could choose a rotation, something like Gemini, Biathlon, and then Snapshot, and that's going to control that spectrum very well, and still trying to rotate through different modes of action. So to pick your best option, figure out what all herbicides you can use based upon crop safety, and then out of those options, figure out which herbicides are going to work the best, at least, to control different weeds at different times of the year. And if you have some issues with some of those hard to control species, make sure to save an application of the herbicide that's effective on that species for when it's bad. So for example, we don't have a lot of herbicides that are really good on doveweed, but a lot of herbicides are going to control oxalis very well. So Marengo, Broadstar, Freehand, those might be good for doveweed. They would also provide control of oxalis. But if we also have a lot of other herbicides that can control oxalis very well, or maybe something like crabgrass, why would we use those herbicides that are effective on doveweed to control oxalis if we need those herbicides that are effective on doveweed during doveweed season, during the warm season? We only get 2 applications with these herbicides a year for most herbicides. So we make sure we want to have at least one of those applications that's effective for doveweed or these problematic species, whether it's doveweed or some cool season. We want to make sure we have at least one of those applications kind of in the chamber for when those difficult to control species start to rear their ugly head. So after you figure out what your worst weeds and all the herbicides that you can use based upon your crops, you might come up with a chart, something like this, to help you plan out your applications throughout the year. And this could just help you visualize your applications and how they could be structured throughout the year to help you narrow down your list of options. You might not necessarily really use 6 different herbicides, and you could repeat an application of the same product, different timings, but still organizing like this might help you visualize what all options you have for your different crops, and then what weeds you need to target at different times of the year. So in this case, you start with Gemini G for bittercress and oxalis, followed by Biathlon. In that case, you're targeting spurge, phyllanthus, and eclipta. Then you follow that up with Marengo or Broadstar, then possibly something like Freehand, and then Fortress, and then OH2. Using the Fortress and the OH2 and the bittercress and oxalis become an issue again in the fall or the winter. So this is just one particular option. There's a lot of other herbicides that could be used in these same timings and this same rotation, depending upon the crops and the weed spectrum, even with this same weed spectrum. This rotation might work in some situations, but it's unlikely it's going to work in every nursery. So you want to figure out your own rotation, the herbicides that work for you, the ones that you have experience with, and always go back and evaluate and improve and adjust as needed. So how many applications are you going to really need throughout the year? Like most things, it's going to depend. It's going to depend upon the season. Like in the summer, you might have a shorter reapplication window than in the winter, depending upon your geography. It's also going to depend upon production practices and things like rainfall, weather. Sanitation practices are huge. One of the cleanest nurseries I've ever been to only made about 4 applications per year. And that was because they focused heavily on sanitation. Their roads, aisles, bark piles, everything was as clean as can be so that weed pressure in the crop areas was very low. So it depends, but on average, most people make about an application every 8 weeks or so during the growing season, and most people have success with that. So one way to get the most mileage out of the herbicides you're applying is sanitation. In these non-crop areas, I recommend people use pre-herbicides to keep those areas clean. And a little investment in these pre-herbicides in these areas can go a very long way and pay dividends really in seasons to come. So good options for these areas might be things like Marengo or SureGuard, which you can't use over the top of your ornamentals, or most ornamentals at least. And they tend to provide pretty good control of a wide variety of weeds. And they're also good tank mix partners with some post-emergence herbicides. If sedges are an issue, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And really some good options for sedges would be things like Pendant Magnum or Tower. There's also a lot of very good options that are sprayable that can be mixed with post-emergence herbicides like Gemini, Barricade, Pendulum, Gallery, Dimension, Surfland, et cetera, a bunch of different really good options. The decision can be based upon the cost, but then also keep in mind to consider the total number of applications and the labor cost that's needed. Some of these newer chemistries can provide longer term control, and so paying a little bit more for that herbicide active ingredient can really benefit you, as opposed to using some older chemistries that might be less expensive but require more frequent applications throughout the year. So thank you all for tuning into this video. I hope this helped go over the process of developing a herbicide rotation. I also want to thank some of the sponsors of my research that made this presentation possible by funding some of my research programs, and that will be the Horticulture Research Institute and American Hort, which have been instrumental. Also the USDA Floriculture and Nursery Research Initiative, Florida Department of Agriculture, and the Florida Nursery Growers and Landscape Association. I also want to thank IPPF Southern Region for all of their support and for inviting me to give this presentation. If anyone has any questions on nursery weed management or weed management in general, please feel free to email me at marblesc@ufl.edu. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again.